Do men need their own political party? Is it time for them to make a stand against feminism? Has feminism gone too far, perhaps? And perhaps men feel eclipsed by it and disenfranchised by it now. One man who thinks so is Mike Buchanan. He's formed a new party called Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. He believes men face discrimination in areas like healthcare and education. He joins me now, along with Holly Combe, who works for the feminist website The F Word. Hello to you, Holly, and Mike.
Hi.
Are you there, Mike? I can't hear Mike. Hello, Mike, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Now I've got you. Okay. I'm glad you are, because we really needed to talk to you. So in what way do you think men are put upon?
Well, British men collectively pay 72% of the income tax in the country, and women just 28%. In cash terms, men pay about £64 billion more income tax than women, yet for well over 30 years, men have been ever more assaulted by the actions and inactions of successive governments. Whenever legislation or official guidance favours one gender over the other, it always favours women over men. I'm not aware of a single piece of legislation or official guidance which favours men over women, and the coalition is just as bad as the preceding Labour administration in this regard.
It's interesting you're talking about successive governments, because those successive governments have been made up almost entirely of men, haven't they, apart from Margaret Thatcher?
Well, they have, you're quite right, but the legislation they pass, I mean, and in fact, Parliament's often criticised for being so male-dominated. But the important point, surely, is that the legislation that they pass is overwhelmingly female-friendly and hostile to men.
What about the pay gap?
The pay gap, if you look like for like, doesn't exist. It's an absolute myth, and it's been discredited so many times. I mean, and by myself and a number of other writers. I mean, it really is just nonsense. So, when you actually look at the people, men and women doing the same work, they earn the same money. It's just not disputed anymore. Okay,
what about the disproportionate number of men on the boards and the CEOs of top companies?
Well, that's a very good example, because for the last 13 months, I've run the Campaign for Merit in Business, and we've pointed out that there's a number of major studies which show that when you drive up the proportion of women on corporate boards, corporate performance declines. And the FTSE 100 in particular, the chairmen are appointing quite a large number of women now onto their boards under the government's threat of legislated quotas, and the government will not engage with us and look at the evidence that the FTSE 100 and in due course the rest of the business sector is going to be severely damaged. And it's not I should say a gender effect. It's a result of it's an inexperience effect. It's driving inexperienced women onto corporate boards.
Let's bring in Holly Combe then from the website The F Word. Holly, that's true, isn't it? Quotas per se are just a bad idea. They're discriminatory, aren't they? You can either do the job or you can't, regardless of your gender.
I think saying per se that quotas are discriminatory, I wouldn't say that. I think that they exist for a good reason. Whether or not they work or are effective is another matter, because I think obviously you do get the knock-on effect that whether you're talking about a quota sort of for any area or any oppressed group, people who are members of the privileged group will buck up against it. And I think when that happens pragmatically, that does actually affect how effective it is in the long run. But that's not the intention. I mean, the intention isn't to sort of twist things around the other way and have women having the advantage. Certainly, it's to even things up.
Okay, what about culturally, Holly? I do get the impression that things have swung slightly too far the other way when it comes to the way that men are perceived physically. That I think that these days, there's an awful lot of men being defined by how they look by other women, and I hear a lot of this, and also it's embedded in our culture when you look at, the Diet Coke break adverts, etc. And that is deemed as perfectly acceptable.
I don't think that's an example of it swinging the other way. I mean, I don't think we've suddenly got a society where there's this female gaze and men are being looked at and women get completely off the hook. I think it still disproportionately falls onto women being looked at in that way. However, that doesn't mean it's a good thing that men are increasingly suffering the same thing. I don't think that two wrongs make a right, but I certainly don't think it's an example of the pendulum swinging the other way. Also, with regard to the Diet Coke advert, I think that particular sort of scenario and setup, I think it's very hinged on a sort of chivalrous idea that it's somehow different when women look at men, and sort of rather patronising and saying, well, it's no threat because it's a bunch of women, which to a certain extent, because of women's position in society historically, there is some truth in it, which is actually quite a painful reminder for feminists. I don't think any feminists are watching that advert and cheering, for sure.
Yeah, well, I'll give you you another basic example of where this is a kind of received wisdom, if you like, and that is the phrase man flu. Now, I know this is a very low-level example, but it's still there, chipping away at the whole thing. And there was a Boots advert over Christmas in which two women were struggling on with terrible colds, and the fellas were, according to the conversation they were having, stuck in bed doing nothing with man flu, and there were the women battling on.
Yeah, see, I find those adverts quite offensive, probably for a slightly different reason, but I think that the whole thing of man flu, it comes from the idea of women being expected to look after men and to sort of do all the things around the house, and sort of this kind of, which is patronising to men, and it is wrong, and it is framing men as if they're somehow rather daft and like children, but it's there to kind of keep going that advantage of women sort of serving men, of women getting on with it, and women working in the home, and women doing all the domestic tasks, and then men sort of being looked after, and I don't think it's very helpful to anyone. I think it's, as I say, I think it's quite offensive to men and women.
Well, it also suggests... Yeah, go on, Mike.
Sorry. I wondered if we might come on to something rather more substantive. So, for example, the state ensures that men pay their ex-partners to support their children, but fails in return to ensure that those men, those fathers, are given reasonable access to their children. Now, that's to our mind an emotional assault, both on the men and on the children, and the state. The state does not enforce contact orders. And
judges still presume, don't they, Holly Combe, that the woman is the better parent. In a 50-50 split, judges still presume that the woman, the female, will be the better parent.
I'm not sure. I think if and when it does stem from that, then that's obviously wrong, because I don't think that women are any better parents than men, and I think a lot of people, would agree with that's not really the point. But I think the fact still remains that, sort of... the women, or people with wombs rather, are the ones that carry the children. And I think that the assumption stems back to that, of the idea that, what are women going to do? Sort of have the babies and then men take them away. And I think that is where the sort of inequality lies. And I think it has quite an unpleasant result on men as well, because I think men who want to parent their children, who want access and who want to see them. I think it's really, obviously that's a bad thing, but I don't think it necessarily stems from the idea that women are better parents. I think it comes from basically women being largely the ones that bear them.
Well, this is isn't that another bit of innate discrimination? I don't know what you think about that, Mike Buchanan, that just because women carry the baby for 9 months, and we all know that's just the biological fact of the matter, that somehow men can't be equal partners in the whole bringing up thing.
Well, I think there are, the fact is there are more women who are happy to spend a great deal of time looking after particularly younger children than there are men. And that's just a biological reality. But if we can come on, if we may, to domestic abuse and violence.
We got about a minute on this, Mike.
Okay, well, at least 40% of victims of domestic abuse and violence are men, and probably a great many more, because men are 3 times as likely as women not to report it. Now, the taxpayer finances over 4,000 places in refuges for women, and just 15 for men.
Yeah, that's staggering. Holly, what's your response to that?
I think, again, sort of men sort of not feeling able to come forward, or, it not being recognised. I think that comes from the sort of macho expectations of men, and men being expected to sort of be physically stronger, and therefore being ridiculed if they're a victim at the hands of a woman. I think, again, my solution to that would be that feminism is part of the solution and not part of the problem with that. I think that, if men are, men do need those services. I don't think that's being disputed, but I think
there are no services available for them.
Well, there should be. I'm not disputing that there should be. I don't think that's the point.
But feminists have ensured that 99.6% of the domestic abuse and violence budget goes to women.
It is mostly women, though, that are the victims of violence. That doesn't mean that men aren't, and that doesn't exist, and that isn't equally deserving of what you're talking about. But it is, structurally speaking, it is mostly women. I wish that wasn't the case. In fact, more likely, I wish that didn't happen at all.
So are you really saying that men getting 15 out of 4,000 places is proportionate when they suffer 40% of the abuse?
I think, I'm not going to get into discussion about stats, because I think if we're going to do that, we need to actually sit down and look at the figures and look where they've come from, and then we can have a proper discussion about it. I think throwing statistics out there, that's not something I think you can have a quick discussion.
Okay, Mike, we'll have to leave it there, and Holly, we'll have to leave it there as well. But just briefly, Mike, if people want to find out more about your party as it is now, political movement, where do they go?
Justice for Men and Boys. j4mb.wordpress.com.
Okay, you can look that up on Google as well if you just type in Mike Buchanan. That's Mike Buchanan then, who is forming that new party for men